Alrighty, good afternoon. Middle School Social Studies. This is Mr. Strahota. It is Thursday, April 2nd. And what I'm going to start doing here is shortening up the screen recording. So the notes for part one here, I'm going to break into two separate parts for a couple reasons. Number one, I've been given recommendations that if videos are longer than like 5 minutes, kids are not even watching them. And number two, it will break up the notes a little bit more so you're not getting so much information at once, you're not getting overwhelmed. So this will be part one of the screen recording, and I will be sharing with you a notes page that you can make a copy of on Google Docs, and you can fill it out as you go. So we are starting Unit 5, which is starting with the presidencies of Washington and Adams. So we just went over creating our United States Constitution and starting our government. So what does America look like in 1790? Well, it is predominantly a rural society, meaning a lot of farming, not a lot of huge cities have yet sprouted up. There is New York City and Boston and Philadelphia, which we've talked about, but mostly it is farming towns and using agriculture for their main means of creating income. So 80% of households were involved in agricultural production, so creating, like we talked about, cash crops in prior units, so creating crops for money. There is 750,000 African Americans, which is 20% of the population. So in America at this time, 1/5 of the population is African Americans, and unfortunately, a lot of them in this time period were utilized for slave labor. And most lived in the South. About 10% lived in the North or on the frontier. So, meaning that I guess I did just kind of misstate something. So, roughly 10% of that population were slaves because the 10% who lived in the North or on the frontier were not being used as slaves. So, roughly half of the population of that 750,000 were being used for slave labor. So now beginning a new government, we talked about this. So some of this is review. Congress convenes in 1789 to talk about their creating of the Constitution, and we're going to now vote for president. So, as many of us know, George Washington will become the first president. He gets 70 electoral votes. John Adams, who will become our second president, gets only 34 electoral votes. Now, you see that John Adams becomes the vice president. During this time period, whoever took second place in the election was automatically given the vice presidential position. So imagine in the 2016 presidential election, Donald Trump won, obviously. So second place would have been Hillary Clinton. So if we still had the same rules in place, Hillary Clinton would currently be the vice president. But once Thomas Jefferson becomes president, he removes that rule because he didn't think that the person you just campaigned against should then work with you. He thought that was weird. So, but during this time period, so then John Adams becomes vice president. The Bill of Rights is adopted by Congress and ratified by the states in 1791, which we talked about both the Bill of Rights and the Constitution in our last unit. And this will be finally ratified in 1791. So, really quickly, some of you are probably like, Strahota, we've talked a lot about Alexander Hamilton. Why are we talking about him again? Well, there's some more we still need to touch on. Some of you are probably like, yes, more Hamilton, please. So, hopefully, everybody can at least enjoy or get something out of this here, talking a little bit more about Hamilton. So, like we mentioned, he's a Federalist, and he's the first Secretary of the Treasury in Washington's cabinet. Again, a cabinet being the close advisors for a president. So he said the war debt was a national responsibility be paid by all states since all of the states benefited. So he called for a national assumption of states' debts, and this also built a sense of American nationalism, meaning that if all the states came together to take care of debt, he felt this was the states actually uniting and actually becoming the United States of America as opposed to just the states of America. However, this would cause some controversy because most debt was held by the Northerners, and sharing it didn't seem fair to the South. Again, a lot of the war in the Revolutionary War took place in the North. And also remember that in the South, they're growing cash crops and they have slave labor as their workforce. So they're making a lot of money because they're raising a lot of revenue and they're not having to pay any of their workers. So the South didn't like this because they didn't think it was fair. Hamilton and the National Bank, he wants to open a national bank in the United States, and he wanted to print that national currency and take care of war debt. As we mentioned in the end of the last unit, different states had different currencies. Hamilton said that's a really ridiculous idea. We need to come up with a similar currency for the entire 13 states. And this will be a good source for expanding capital and a growing economy. So again, if you can create banks, then you can give out loans and people can start building homes or starting businesses. So he thought this was a really good idea to get the economy going. And he argues that the bank is necessary and therefore it falls under Article 1 of the Constitution. And we're going to talk about Article 1 here on the next slide because Thomas Jefferson has a very different take on the national bank. He argues that the bank does not fall under Article 1's necessary and proper clause. So Jefferson didn't think if a bank wasn't mentioned in the necessary and proper, he didn't think the government should have any say in creating a national bank. He said that was not the government's responsibility. So Madison and Anti-Federalists, who Thomas Jefferson was also an Anti-Federalist, led this opposition, saying it was unconstitutional to create a national bank. So they were basically saying it doesn't say it in the Constitution, so it would be unconstitutional for us to start a bank. So they vote on it in Congress. The Northern representatives voted 33-1 for a bank, which makes sense because that was led by Alexander Hamilton, who again was from the northern state of New York. The Southern representatives voted 19-6 against it, which again also makes sense because the South again was making a lot of money with their cash crops and slave labor, so they did not want a national bank because they didn't want to help pay for the debts of the North. Well, this led to a question then of how strict should we interpret the Constitution? Or does the government have some leeway in interpreting the Constitution? And this is why the Supreme Court today and the judicial branch is so important because they help interpret laws and determine if they are constitutional or not. So, what was George Washington's take on this? Well, so Hamilton now in the National Bank, so Washington accepts Hamilton's argument that the government does indeed have the right to charter certain institutions, whether or not it is clearly stated in the Constitution. So this is an important precedent sent by George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, and that the government does have some leeway in creating different institutions for government. So the National Bank is then created and it is overseen by a federal government. However, 80% will be financed by outside investors. So just like investing in stock today, some people put investments in banks hoping to get some type of money in return. So this will be the last slide I will conclude with for today. So just to quickly wrap up Hamilton's legacy, he had 4 major achievements that we'll talk about. First, he enhanced the value of the dollar, helping create the national currency and getting rid of state currency. He secured the government's credit, meaning that when you created the national bank, helping take care of different credit issues and debts that different states had, the banks helped deal with that issue. He attracted foreign capital, meaning once other nations saw that we had a well-established economy with both banks and getting rid of debt, that other foreign countries now wanted to trade and do business with us. And he helped prosperity begin to flourish. So again, if people can take out loans from banks, they can start building different things that can help boost the economy and it can help boost morale in the entire states. Some of the weaknesses he had was he never really understood the people of the farms and frontier, which again, like I mentioned on the first slide today, roughly 80% of our population at this time were those rural farmers and those who lived on the frontier. So he didn't relate very well with the majority of the population, which sometimes people criticized him for. And lastly, he was accused of being an elitist, meaning he felt he was better than a lot of people. And sometimes when you are trying to create different laws or different institutions in the government, sometimes if you have a very different take than other people, you might not create rules or laws that everybody agrees with. So again, he did have his pros and cons, but again, he was very influential and important in the start of our United States of America.